The line of people stretched all the way to the back of the hall, disappearing behind a heavy velvet curtain that separated the hopefuls from the stage. Outside, the sun was bright, but inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and expensive perfume. It was the kind of place where the floors were so shiny you could see your reflection in them, and every sound echoed. It was the day of the regional piano competition, a big deal for anyone who wanted to make a career in music. Most of the people waiting in the line looked like they belonged in a magazine. The young men wore suits that were perfectly pressed, with ties done up in neat knots. The young women had their hair pinned back in elegant styles, and they held their sheet music in black folders. They looked calm, or at least they pretended to be. Some were lightly humming to themselves, moving their fingers over invisible keys in the air to warm up. Others stood still, their faces pale with nerves. They all had one thing in common: they looked polished. They looked like money. Then, there was the girl at the very end of the line. She stood out like a smudge on a clean window. Her name was Illyra, though nobody in the room knew that yet. She didn't have a black leather folder holding her music. In fact, she didn't have any music at all. Her hands were empty, hanging loosely by her sides. Her clothes were clean, but they were clearly old. She wore a gray sweater that had seen better days, the cuffs were frayed, and there was a tiny hole near the collar that she had tried to mend with a thread that didn't quite match the color. Her pants were a bit too long, bunching up slightly over her scuffed sneakers. They weren't the kind of shoes you wear to a piano competition. They were the kind of shoes you wear for walking miles on pavement. While the others in line were discussing their private tutors or the difficulty of the pieces they had chosen, Illyra just stared at the floor. She felt the eyes of the people near her. She saw a girl in a blue dress look her up and down, then quickly look away, whispering something to the boy standing next to her. They didn't say it out loud, but Illyra could hear their thoughts as if they were shouting. She didn't fit here. She looked like she should be outside, maybe sitting on a sidewalk or waiting for a bus, not standing in the lobby of the Grand Theatre. Illyra shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her feet hurt. She had walked a long way to get here because she couldn't afford the fare for the tram. It wasn't just the walking, though. It was the weight of everything. Her life was not like the lives of these other kids. She didn't have a quiet room in a big house to practice on a Steinway. Her story was written on the streets. For the past year, home had been whatever warm corner she could find, or the spare room of a shelter when there was space. Music was the only thing that didn't smell like smoke or exhaust fumes. Music was the only thing that didn't make her feel hungry. There was an old community center a few blocks from where she usually slept. They had a dusty upright piano in the corner that nobody really used. It was out of tune, and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them down, but it was there. Illyra would go there late at night, after the volunteers had locked up, if she could sneak in through the side window that didn't latch properly. She would play in the dark, letting the sound fill the empty room. She taught herself by listening to old songs on a cracked radio she had found. Number 42, a voice called out from the front of the line. The line moved forward. People smoothed their jackets, checked their hair in the mirrors on the walls, and took deep breaths to steady themselves. Illyra watched them go. She saw them walk through the heavy curtains and disappear into the brightness of the stage. Sometimes she could hear the faint sound of applause from the other side, but mostly it was just muffled noise. She rubbed her palms on her sweater. Her palms were sweaty, a sharp contrast to the dry, cool air of the theater. She looked at her hands. They weren't soft like the hands of the girl in the blue dress. Illyra's hands were rough. Her fingernails were cut short, not for fashion, but to keep them clean. There were calluses on her fingertips, not just from playing piano, but from scraping against hard surfaces, from carrying heavy bags, from holding onto the rough edges of life. A man in a tuxedo walked down the line, checking names off a clipboard. He moved with efficiency, barely looking at the contestants as he confirmed their identities. When he got to Elora, he stopped. He looked at his clipboard, then he looked at her. He raised an eyebrow. "Elora," he asked, his voice doubtful. She nodded. "Yes." He sighed, a short, sharp puff of air that showed his impatience. "You're up next. Don't waste the judges' time. They are looking for professionals." Elora didn't say anything. She just nodded again. She didn't have the energy to explain that she wasn't a professional, that she was just a girl who loved the way the keys felt under her fingers. The tuxedo man walked away, and the person in front of her went through the curtains. Now, Elora was alone at the front of the line. She could hear the murmuring of the crowd inside the main hall. It sounded like the ocean, a constant low roar of conversation. She thought about turning around and walking out the way she came. She thought about going back to the streets where people didn't expect anything from her. It would be easier. It would be safer. If she stayed, they would laugh at her. She knew they would. She could see it in their eyes every time she moved. But then she thought about the dusty piano in the community center. She thought about the way the music made her feel when everything else was falling apart. It made her feel like she was floating, like gravity couldn't touch her. If she walked out now, she would just be a street girl again. But if she played, even for a minute, she would be a musician. That was worth the risk. "Number 43, the voice boomed, much louder this time. Elora took a breath. It felt like she was inhaling broken glass. She stepped forward. Her sneakers made no sound on the plush carpet that led to the stage entrance. She pushed aside the velvet curtain. The light hit her face, blinding her for a moment. She walked out of the shadows and into the open space of the stage. The silence that fell over the room wasn't a respectful silence. It was a confused silence. Elora walked to the center of the stage, a vast expanse of polished wood that felt endless under her feet. In the middle sat a grand piano, black and gleaming like a pool of oil. It looked majestic. It looked terrifying. She walked toward the bench. She could feel the eyes of the hundreds of people in the audience. They were boring into her back. She sat down. The bench was smooth leather, cold against her legs. She adjusted it, trying to find the right height. From somewhere in the front row, she heard a cough, followed by a low whisper. "Is this a joke?" a voice whispered loudly. Elora ignored it. She placed her hands on her knees. She looked at the keys. They were white and pristine, unlike the yellowing keys she was used to. For a second, she felt a wave of panic wash over her. She didn't belong here. This was a palace, and she was an intruder. But then she closed her eyes for a split second. She imagined the dark community center. She imagined the smell of rain on the pavement outside the window. She remembered the feeling of the music being the only warm thing in her world. She opened her eyes again. She wasn't here for them. She was here for the music. She was here to show the world that beauty didn't just come from people with money and nice clothes. It could come from anywhere. Even from the gutter. She lifted her hands from her lap and hovered them over the keys. The room was dead silent, waiting. The judges were looking at her, their pens hovering over their papers, ready to write her off before she even played a single note. She could feel the disdain radiating from the panel like heat from a fire. It was heavy, it was suffocating, but she refused to let it crush her. She took one last breath, settled her fingers into position, and prepared to speak the only language she had ever truly mastered. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from respect. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room is holding their breath, waiting for a crash or a disaster. Elora sat on the bench, her back to the crowd, staring at the 88 black and white keys in front of her. To her, they looked like a vast, empty city waiting to be explored. To the three judges sitting at the long table just a few feet away, she looked like a mistake that needed to be corrected quickly. The judges were a collection of people who had spent their lives in concert halls, wearing expensive clothes and listening to the best musicians in the world. In the center sat a man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He was known for being harsh. He didn't just dislike bad music, he seemed to dislike waste. He looked at the girl in the frayed gray sweater and sighed audibly, the sound scratching through the quiet air. Beside him, a woman with sharp glasses clicked her pen impatiently, her eyes darting from the girl's worn sneakers to the dirty hem of her pants. The third judge, a younger man with a bored expression, leaned back in his chair and checked his watch, as if he already knew this was going to be a waste of his time. The tension was so thick you could almost touch it. Elora could feel their eyes burning into her back. She knew what they were seeing. They didn't see a person with a soul or a story. They saw someone who had wandered in off the street by accident. She felt small. In the shelter, she had learned to make herself invisible, to curl up in corners so people wouldn't step on her. But here, there was nowhere to hide. The spotlight was bright and hot, exposing every flaw in her appearance. "Excuse me," the voice boomed, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the man in the center. He didn't use the microphone, but his voice was strong and carried easily to the stage. Elora froze, her hands hovering just inches above the keys. She didn't turn around immediately. She was terrified that if she moved, the spell would break, and she would run away. "I said, excuse me," he repeated, louder this time. Elora slowly turned on the bench to face the panel. The light made it hard to see their faces clearly, but she could feel their posture. They were closed off, defensive, unwelcoming. The woman with the glasses didn't even look at her face, she was busy writing something on a notepad, probably a note about how the girl was unprepared. "Are you lost?" the main judge asked, a dry, sarcastic edge to his tone. "This is a piano competition, not a waiting room for the bus station. We have a schedule to keep, and we don't have time for pranks." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience. It was the laughter of people who were relieved they weren't the ones being mocked. It was cruel laughter. Elora felt her face get hot. A flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to stand up and say that she wasn't lost. She wanted to tell them that she had walked 3 miles in the cold to get here, and that she had practiced on a broken piano in the dark while they were sleeping in warm beds. But the words stuck in her throat. She had no voice, only the music. I am here to play," Elora managed to whisper. Her voice was shaky and thin, sounding small in the giant room. The judge raised an eyebrow and looked at his colleagues, amused. "Play with what sheet music, or were you planning to just bang on the keys until we ask you to leave?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, interlacing his fingers. "Look, I'm sure you think this is a heartwarming story or something, but this is a serious event. People have trained for years for this moment. You look like you haven't slept in a week, and quite frankly, you're distracting the judges. Please, step down before you embarrass yourself further." The cruelty was casual. It wasn't screaming or shouting, it was the calm dismissal of someone who holds all the power. It hurt more than if he had yelled. It was the assumption that she was worthless before she had even touched a key. The audience was quiet now, the laughter dying down as the meanness of the situation became clear. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but watching intensely. It was like watching a car crash. You didn't want to look, but you couldn't look away. Ilora turned back to the piano. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Don't you dare cry." If she cried, they won. They would say, "Look, she's just a child, she can't handle it." She wasn't just a child. She was a survivor. She had survived nights when the temperature dropped below freezing. She had survived hunger and loneliness and being ignored by thousands of people walking down the street. She could survive a few rude words from a man in a suit. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out slowly. She blocked out the man's voice, which was grumbling something about calling security. She blocked out the woman who was still scribbling on her pad. She focused entirely on the instrument in front of her. The piano didn't care about her clothes. It didn't care about her sneakers or her messy hair. It only cared about vibration. It only cared about touch. In the dusty community center, the piano was her best friend. It was the only thing that listened to her. When she played, she wasn't a homeless girl anymore. She was a queen, she was a bird, she was the wind. She could be anything. She closed her eyes for a brief second and transported herself back to that small, dim room. She imagined the smell of old wood and the sound of the rain tapping against the single pane of glass. She felt the calmness settle over her. Ilora positioned her hands over the keys. She didn't need sheet music because the notes were etched into her mind. She had played this piece 1,000 times in the dark, until her fingers bled and her arms ached. It was the only thing she had to give. The judge in the center let out a loud, exaggerated huff of air. "All right, that's enough. You've had your fun. Security is going to escort you out." He started to motion to the side of the stage. But before he could finish the gesture, before the security guards could take a step forward, Ilora's fingers descended. They didn't strike the keys hard. They didn't bang. She touched them with a gentleness that shocked the air. The first note was soft, like a whisper in a library, but it rang out with a clarity that cut through the tension like a laser beam. It was in a minor chord, full of sadness and longing. The judge froze with his hand half raised. The security guards stopped in their tracks. The woman with the glasses stopped writing. The sound that came from the instrument was not what they expected. It wasn't noise. It was beautiful. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. Ilora didn't look at them. She didn't care about them anymore. She was gone, lost in the music. Her fingers, rough and calloused, began to move across the ivories with a grace that seemed impossible. It was as if her hands had a mind of their own. They danced, they wept, they told a story that no words could ever express. The mockery hung in the air for just a second longer, and then it dissolved, completely destroyed by the sound of a street girl finding her voice. The sound that floated from the grand piano didn't seem like it belonged in that shiny, polished hall. It was raw. It was real. The first chord Ilora struck was like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of sound moved outwards, washing over the dusty velvet seats, the bright lights, and the stunned faces of the judges. It was a sound that held a deep, vibrating sadness, the kind of sadness that doesn't come from a broken heart, but from a tired soul. Elora didn't move her body the way the other players did. She didn't sway dramatically or throw her hair around. She sat very still, her eyes fixed on her hands as if they were strangers she was just getting to know. But her fingers were moving with a life of their own. They were calloused and rough, usually used to scrubbing floors or gripping cold metal handles, but on the ivory keys, they were unexpectedly gentle. The music she played was complicated. It was an old piece, full of fast runs and tricky jumps, usually reserved for the students who had practiced in fancy academies since they were 4 years old. But Elora played it differently. The students at the academies played with perfect technique, hitting every note exactly as the paper said. They were precise, like machines. Elora played with emotion. She sped up when the feeling took her and slowed down when the sadness got too heavy. It wasn't perfect in a textbook sense, but it was perfect in a human sense. The judge in the center, the man with the silver hair and the cruel tongue, was frozen. He had been waving his hand to signal the guards, but now his hand just hung in the air. He was looking at the girl's back, trying to figure out what was happening. He had expected a mess of noise, a child banging on the keys. He expected to be annoyed. Instead, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. The melody was weaving itself into the air, bypassing his brain and going straight to his heart. It reminded him of something, a memory he hadn't touched in years, a rainy afternoon from his childhood, a feeling of being small and alone. The audience, which had been full of whispers and giggles just moments before, was now deadly silent. You couldn't hear a single cough or a shuffle of a shoe. Hundreds of people were holding their breath at the same time. It was as if the room had turned into a vacuum, sucking all the air out and replacing it with music. They looked at the girl in the gray sweater. Before, they had seen a problem. Now, they saw a mystery. How could someone who looked like she had nothing, play like she owned the world? Elora's right hand flew up the high keys, playing a fast, tumbling run that sounded like water rushing over stones. Her left hand kept a steady, heavy rhythm, like a heartbeat. The friction of her fingertips against the keys created a unique sound. Because her skin was tough, the notes had a slightly percussive attack, a little bite to the sound that made the music feel urgent. It wasn't smooth and glassy, it was gritty and textured, like the pavement she lived on. She played a section of the song that was meant to be loud and angry. Other contestants played it with force, trying to show off their power. Elora played it with desperation. It wasn't a show of power, it was a cry for help. She hit the keys harder, and the piano roared. For a second, the harsh man on the judging panel flinched. He saw the girl's shoulders hunch forward. He realized she wasn't playing at the piano, she was fighting it. She was fighting the sadness, the hunger, and the cold, pouring all of that fight into the music. The woman with the sharp glasses had stopped writing completely. Her pen was lying on the table, forgotten. She adjusted her glasses, leaning in closer, her eyes wide. She was a musician, trained to hear mistakes, to catch a missed note or a wrong timing. But she couldn't find any. Or maybe, she just didn't care to look for them anymore. The music was too captivating. She watched Elora's hands that looked like they belonged to a laborer and saw them create art. It broke her idea of what a musician looked like. She felt a sudden wash of guilt for the sneer she had on her face earlier. Elora's mind was far away from the theater. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the people watching. She was back in the community center. She could see the peeling paint on the walls. She could hear the wind howling outside the broken window. She was playing for the nights she couldn't sleep. She was playing for the people who looked at her and saw nothing. Every note was a word she never got to say. I am here, the music seemed to say. I matter. The song moved into a slower, quieter section. The volume dropped until the notes were barely whispers. The entire auditorium leaned in. People strained to hear. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't a waiting silence, it was a sharing silence. Everyone was sharing this moment with her. The rich lady in the front row felt her eyes water. The young man in the balcony stopped scrolling on his phone. A teenage boy who had come to laugh at the street kid felt a lump form in his throat. Ilara's foot pressed down on the sustain pedal, holding the notes in the air. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the hall. It was a beautiful, mournful sound that hung there like fog. The vibrations from the piano traveled through the floor, up the bench, and into Ilara's bones. It made her feel warm inside, a feeling she rarely had. The cruelty of the man's voice, "This isn't a bus terminal," seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The mockery couldn't survive in the face of such beauty. The music was a shield that Ilara had built around herself, and it was impenetrable. They couldn't touch her now. She was not a homeless girl anymore, she was a creator. She was taking the pain of her life and turning it into something that made other people feel. That was power. Real power. As she approached the climax of the piece, the music became faster and more complex. Her hands crossed over each other, dancing up and down the keyboard. She was sweating now, small beads of perspiration on her forehead, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't dare stop. She was pouring everything she had left into this one performance. She had no second chances. This was it. The man in the center stared at his hands on the table. He felt something wet on his cheek and was surprised to find a tear there. He quickly brushed it away, looking around to see if anyone noticed. But no one was looking at him. Everyone was looking at her. He realized then that he had been wrong. Not just a little wrong, but completely and terribly wrong. He had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside was rewriting itself in front of his eyes. He felt small. The girl on the stage, in her frayed cardigan, looked like a giant. Ilara's fingers didn't falter. They knew the way. They had traveled this path many times in the dark. The roughness of her skin gripped the smooth ivory, creating a connection that was electric. The piano was singing for her, crying for her, screaming for her. It was the most honest thing that had ever happened in that competition hall. There was no pretense, no show. Just a raw nerve exposed to the world. And the room let her. The silence stretched, filled only with the cascading notes. It was a trance. The audience was under a spell, and Ilara was the witch who had cast it, not with magic, but with truth. They weren't bored anymore. They were terrified to miss a single second. They were witnessing a miracle, and they all knew it. The atmosphere in the great hall had changed completely. It was like the air pressure had dropped, making it hard to breathe. The mocking whispers, the rude comments, and the judgmental stares were gone, wiped away by the flood of sound coming from the stage. In their place was a heavy, stunned silence that felt sacred. No one shifted in their seats. No one checked their watches or looked at their phones. Hundreds of people were frozen, captivated by the small figure hunched over the grand piano. Ilara had her eyes closed now. She wasn't looking at the keys anymore, she didn't need to. Her hands were moving on their own, guided by a memory and a feeling that was stronger than any fear. The music had shifted into a slower, more haunting melody. It was a sound that seemed to reach into the chests of the listeners and squeeze tight. It was the sound of loneliness, but also the sound of survival. Every note she played was filled with a deep, aching beauty that hurt to listen to, but was impossible to turn away from. The main judge, the man with the silver hair who had been so cruel only minutes before, was leaning forward in his chair. His elbows were resting on the table, his hands clasped tightly together under his chin. He was staring at Elora, but he wasn't seeing the frayed sweater or the messy hair anymore. He saw only the passion radiating from her. He felt a knot forming in his throat, a lump that he couldn't swallow away. For the first time in years, he felt small. He realized that this girl, who had nothing in the material world, possessed a wealth of spirit that he could never hope to understand. He had spent his life judging people based on their polish and their pedigree, and here was a street girl showing him what true art looked like. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just let it fall. Next to him, the woman with the sharp glasses was crying openly. She had taken off her glasses entirely because they were fogged up from her tears. She wasn't hiding her emotions anymore. The wall of professionalism she had built around herself had been shattered by the music. She looked at the girl's hands, those rough, workers' hands, and marveled at how they could produce something so delicate. She thought about her own comfortable life, her warm house, and her easy successes, and she felt a pang of guilt. She realized that she had never truly played with her whole heart because she had never known what it was like to have nothing else. Elora was playing for her life, and the intensity of it was terrifying and beautiful. The transformation in the room was total. The wealthy patrons in the front rows, who earlier had turned their noses up at the girl, were now leaning forward with their mouths slightly open, completely mesmerized. A young man in the balcony, who had come to the competition hoping to see a spectacle, found himself holding his breath without realizing it. He felt a strange burning in his eyes, a reaction he hadn't had since he was a child. The music wasn't just entering their ears, it was bypassing their brains and connecting directly with their hearts. It made them remember their own sadness, their own struggles, and their own dreams that had been buried under layers of daily life. Elora was lost in the sound. She couldn't see the tears or the rapt attention. She was back on the cold streets, but the music was wrapping around her like a warm coat. She was pouring every missed meal, every cold night, and every harsh word she had ever heard into the keys. It was a release. For these few minutes, she wasn't a homeless girl. She wasn't an outcast. She was a giant. She was powerful. The feeling of the piano vibrating beneath her fingers was the only thing that felt real. The vibrations traveled up her arms and into her chest, mixing with her heartbeat until she couldn't tell where she ended and the music began. The song was building again, moving toward its final, powerful climax. Elora's left hand was playing a deep, rolling rhythm that sounded like thunder, while her right hand played notes that sparkled like lightning in a storm. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the vast hall. It wasn't aggressive noise, it was a triumphant roar. It was the sound of someone saying, "I am here." The security guards, who had been standing by the side of the stage looking bored and ready to remove the girl, were now standing still, their arms hanging loosely by their sides. They exchanged looks with each other, their eyes wide. They weren't used to this kind of thing. Usually, their job was to stop trouble, but this was the opposite of trouble. This was magic. One of the guards, a big man who usually looked scary, had a soft look on his face. He was a father, and listening to the girl made him think of his own daughter, and the hopes he had for her. Even the people operating the cameras were affected. The man in the production booth at the back of the room usually focused on getting the shot right, checking the focus and the lighting. But today, he found himself staring at the monitor, mesmerized. He forgot to zoom in. He forgot to cut to the judges. He just watched the screen, feeling the hair on his arms stand up. He knew he was capturing something special, something that didn't happen often in a lifetime. He moved his hand slightly on the joystick, keeping the camera steady on Ilara's face. She looked beautiful in her concentration, glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with the stage lights. The cynical mask that the world wore had been cracked. The music had slipped through the crack and touched the raw, human core underneath. In that moment, there was no rich or poor, no clean or dirty. There was only the shared experience of the song. The barriers that people put up to protect themselves from the world were melting away. It was a terrifying feeling for some, to be so open, but it was also liberating. Ilara hit a series of chords that were so full of emotion they felt like physical blows. They resonated through the floorboards, through the benches, and into the bones of everyone sitting there. It was a cry of pure existence. The sound swelled, hanging in the air for a long moment before beginning to fade. She was bringing it home now, guiding the song to its conclusion. The notes became softer, slower, like a heartbeat returning to normal after a great fright. She was whispering the end of the story, a quiet promise that despite the pain, everything was going to be okay. The man in the center seat, the one who had mocked her, was no longer the judge. He was the one being judged, and he found himself wanting. He felt a profound sense of shame, but also a strange sense of gratitude. He was grateful that he had stayed in his seat, that he hadn't stopped her, because he would have missed the most moving performance he had ever heard. He looked at the other judges, and they looked at him. They all knew. The competition was over. There was no point in scoring anyone else. They had just witnessed the winner, in every sense that mattered. The silence in the room deepened as the final notes faded away, a silence that was full of awe and a newfound respect. They weren't listening to a street girl anymore. They were listening to a master. As the last vibration of the final note faded into the high rafters of the auditorium, a heavy silence fell over the room. It wasn't the awkward silence that waits for a mistake, nor was it the polite silence of a bored audience. It was a breathless, electric quiet, the kind that happens when hundreds of people are completely overwhelmed. The sound seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, refusing to disappear completely. Ilara sat still, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance. Her eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if she was listening to the ghost of the music as it drifted away. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The bright stage lights blinded her for a second, making her squint. She felt the hardness of the bench under her legs and the coldness of the air conditioning against her sweaty face. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. She thought she was back in the dark community center, alone with her thoughts. Then she shifted her weight, and the scuff of her sneaker against the floor brought her back to reality. She was on the stage of the Grand Theater. She had played. It was done. Ilara pulled her hands away from the piano and placed them in her lap. She turned her head slightly to look at the judges' table. She expected to see them writing on their clipboards, making notes about how she hadn't bowed properly or how she looked a mess. She expected them to wave her off so the next contestant could come up. She was ready to stand up, walk off the stage, and disappear back into the shadows where she felt safe. But nobody was writing anything. The judges were just staring at her. The man with the silver hair had his elbows on the table and his face buried in his hands for a second, rubbing his eyes. When he looked up, his face was red. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, washing away the layers of arrogance and cynicism he had worn like armor. He looked at Elora, and for the first time, he didn't see a street kid. He saw a human being who had just poured her soul out for him. The silence stretched on. It became so loud that it started to feel uncomfortable. Elora felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Had she played too softly? Were they angry because she had taken up their time? She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles turning white again. She prepared herself for the sharp whistle of the guard or the booming voice telling her to get out. Then, a single sound broke the quiet. It was the sharp clap of two hands hitting together. It came from the center of the judge's table. The silver-haired man was standing up. He was clapping slowly, methodically. Clap. 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 He wasn't looking at the other judges to see if they would join in. He didn't care about the protocol. He was clapping for her. He looked directly at Elora, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and profound respect. He nodded at her, a deep, meaningful nod that acknowledged what she had just survived and what she had just achieved. That sound acted like a match dropped into a pool of gasoline. Suddenly, the woman with the sharp glasses was on her feet. She was wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue, but she was applauding wildly. She wasn't holding back anymore. Then the third judge stood up. And then another person in the front row stood up. Then a whole section of the audience rose. It started as a rumble, like a distant train, and then grew into a deafening roar. The applause wasn't just polite clapping, it was a thunderous wave of sound that crashed against the walls of the theater. People were shouting bravo. And encore. Some were stamping their feet. The sheer volume of it was shocking. It vibrated in Elora's chest, shaking her to her core. Elora sat there, stunned. She looked out at the sea of faces. They were blurred by the lights, but she could see that they were standing. Every single person was on their feet. The rich lady in the fur coat was clapping so hard her hands were red. The teenagers in the back were whistling and cheering. The security guards were smiling and clapping along. It was a wall of sound, but it wasn't a wall that kept her out. It was a wall that was lifting her up. She didn't know what to do. She had never been bowed to before. She had never been cheered. She felt a strange, hot sensation in her own eyes. Her vision swam, and she quickly blinked the tears away. She didn't want them to see her cry. She wanted to be strong. Slowly, awkwardly, Elora stood up. She felt wobbly, like a newborn deer learning to walk. Her legs felt like jelly. She turned to face the audience fully. The light was blinding now, hiding the individual faces, but she could feel the energy coming from them. It wasn't the energy of judgment or disgust. It was warmth. It was love. It was the total opposite of the cold sidewalk she was used to. She gave a small, shy curtsy. It wasn't a perfect stage bow. It was clumsy and hesitant. But when she did it, the roar of the crowd got even louder. They didn't care that she didn't know the proper etiquette. They loved her because she was real. They loved her because she had turned her pain into something beautiful that touched them all. The main judge walked to the edge of the stage. He didn't have a microphone, but the crowd quieted down slightly, eager to hear what he had to say. He leaned over the railing, looking up at the small girl in the gray sweater. "I have been judging this competition for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion and cracking slightly. I have heard thousands of players. Students from the best schools in the world. People with perfect technique and expensive instruments. He paused, wiping his face again. But I have never heard anything like that in my life. You didn't just play the notes. You played the truth. You have a gift that cannot be taught in any school. He looked down at his shoes for a moment, ashamed of how he had treated her earlier. When he looked up, his eyes were honest. I want to apologize to you, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I misjudged you. I was wrong. And I am sorry. A hush fell over the crowd at his words. It was rare for a man like him to admit he was wrong, especially to a girl like Illyra. But he meant it? Illyra just nodded. She didn't have the words to answer him. Her throat was tight. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she had been carrying for years. The shame of being poor, the shame of being different, it was all gone, evaporated by the music and the forgiveness in that man's eyes. The judge stepped back and raised his hand, signaling something to the side of the stage. A woman in a headset came rushing out, looking confused but excited. The judge pointed to Illyra and then to the piano again. Play something else, the judge shouted over the noise. Please. Just one more. The crowd went wild again, chanting her name. Illyra. 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 She looked at the piano bench, then at the expectant faces. She wasn't tired anymore. The energy in the room was feeding her. She sat back down. She didn't have any other complex pieces memorized, the ones she knew were just songs she had made up in the quiet of the night. She decided to play one of those. It was a simple melody, light and hopeful. As she began to play, the mood in the room shifted from awe to joy. It was like the sun coming out after a storm. People began to smile. It was a sound of hope, a promise that no matter how dark the night is, the morning always comes. Illyra smiled too, a genuine, bright smile that reached her eyes. She wasn't the street girl anymore. She was a musician. She was an artist. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was seen. She was heard. She was home.